wrong? It's wrong. Sorry. Gen Z's lazy.
Oh dear. We're about to destroy these Gen Z haters, aren't we?
Yes, we are, Chris. Yes, we are. Buckle up, guys. This is gonna be fun.
Gen Z doesn't understand hard work. Sorry, that's a fact.
No, Tim. That is what we call an opinion. That is literally the definition of an opinion. Now, you have a right to hold that opinion. Some people might even agree with your wrong opinion. But this is just embarrassingly hilarious. I've never seen someone so adamantly scream, "That's a fact," after stating something that's so clearly and obviously an opinion. I'll tell you something that is a fact, though. Gen Z actually works twice as much for far worse wages than literal ancient Roman slaves and the Egyptians who built the pyramids. Wait a minute. How is this possible, you might ask? We were always taught that life was so brutal back then. Slave work was so horrible, and we should be so grateful to this abomination of modern society for any horseshit job with horseshit wages we can get. It's gotten to a point where you're not even allowed to talk about slavery because comparing it to modern day work is insensitive to slaves. But once you start digging and actually researching history, you'll see that comparing slavery to modern day working conditions that Gen Z faces today isn't insensitive to slaves, it's insensitive to Gen Z. What comes to mind when you think of the Great Pyramids, aside from the majestic wonder that it is? Specifically, what comes to your mind when you think about how much human labor and sacrifice it must have cost in order to build such a grand monument, without any of the machinery and technology we have today, of course? You probably think and were taught that it was absolutely horrific and brutal. In fact, your boomer parents have probably used this to gaslight you at some point. Hey, you should be grateful you're sitting at a desk in a soulless cubicle getting exploited for corporate profits. Imagine if you were an ancient Egyptian slave building the pyramids. Well, after seeing these next 5 minutes of historical facts, you'll probably find yourself wishing you were an ancient Egyptian pyramid builder. Now, first of all, we have to debunk a common misconception. The ancient Egyptians who built the pyramids weren't actually slaves. This is a widespread old school myth that you probably believed, and I did too, before making this video. They were actually seasonal rotation workers who were conscripted from local farming villages to work on the pyramids in intense but very short and temporary bursts. Usually only about 1 month out of the year. I know, I used to think that they worked on the pyramids 24/7, 365 as well, but this was far from the case. If you think about it logically, back then work wasn't specialized the way it is now. People mostly had to farm and grow their own food back then, and if everyone was forced to work on the pyramids all year round, who would even feed the pyramid builders? Now make no mistake, during the 1 month of the year where you were building the pyramids, the work was undoubtedly physically grueling and intense. But that's kind of the point. Our caveman ancestors who we evolved from always liked to work in short, intense bursts with plenty of rest in between. For example, expending a huge burst of energy to hunt an animal, but then getting to rest for an extended period after the animal was caught as well. This is just a natural biological rhythm that humans evolved with and is a much healthier and more natural workflow than our modern lives of constant, never-ending work. And you'll see this pattern play out later when we discuss the workflow of ancient Roman slaves as well. But before we get too distracted, let's get back to our life as an Egyptian pyramid builder. So we've talked about working conditions, but what about compensation? How well were Egyptian pyramid builders compensated for their work? And how does it compare to the modern day dogshit wages employers pay Gen Z these days? For starters, the state was fully responsible for fully funding and providing housing, food, and even beer for all their workers. We're talking several liters of beer per day. And it wasn't just a bare minimum either. Pyramid builders were fed a very supple diet of meat, bread, garlic, onions, and dates. They ate much better than the peasants who stayed in the villages. Also, get this, archaeological evidence has even shown that they had medical care far ahead of their time. There's even been proof uncovered of broken bones that were actually healed correctly. That's right, they had far better healthcare benefits than an American Gen Z worker today. We all know most employers today engage in the most disgusting and sinister tactics to try to deny your healthcare. For example, classifying you as a gig worker or giving you exactly 39 hours a week so they don't have to pay benefits. I'm sure some corporate shills are going to pop up in the comments now like, but our medical technology is so much better today. Yeah, but what good is it even if I can't even access it? If you were to break a bone today on the job, most cases, your employer will not cover it. All the advanced MRIs, medications, and therapies that exist now only help you if they're even remotely affordable and accessible, which we all know they're not. Now, we've covered the work schedule of an ancient Egyptian pyramid builder so far, but it's also worth going over their life outside of the 1 month they were building the pyramids. You might be wondering what they did to survive in the other 11 months, and this is a good question. For starters, there is a 4-month period every year known as Akhet, where the Nile River floods and farming becomes impossible. It was in this period when Egyptians were conscripted to work on the pyramids for one of those 4 months. The other 3 months were, for the most part, leisure and holiday. Remember that just about all work back then was agricultural work, so when the river flooded, it was physically impossible to work even if you wanted to. If you wanted to participate in work-related activities such as fishing, basket weaving, or community building, you could. But you weren't forced to. You didn't have a boss looking over your shoulder or a clock-in, clock-out schedule to follow. So how good were wages back then compared to what they are today? It's hard to give an exact answer on this as currency and economics have changed so much. But using historical research, we can come up with a rough estimate. People back then were paid in grain rations, and historians who study the matter estimate that an average worker's grain ration was enough to support a small family. So, how much money would you need to support a small family today? Well, let's be very, very generous and say $40,000. This is probably way too generous considering how bad inflation has gotten, but since we're estimating here, it's better to be on the safe side. But you have to keep in mind that this was $40,000 extra after your rent, food, and basic living expenses were already covered. Rent, in fact, didn't even exist back then. After a family built their house, it was passed on for countless generations. Now, compare this to your asshole boomer parents demanding you move out at 18 in this insane rental market. The average rent price is $2,000 a month now. And with how expensive groceries have gotten, the average American has to spend a staggering $832 per month on food. Let's again be very generous and say this adds up to $3,000 per month if you include other miscellaneous living expenses. This adds up to $36,000 per year of living expenses that ancient Egyptians didn't have to pay for. And when you combine this with the roughly $40,000 per year they made in the form of grain rations, this meant that the average Egyptian was making at least $76,000 per year in today's money. But wait, this is per year. Remember, they also had an entire 3 months off and in general only worked about half as much as we do today. So how much does this translate to, roughly speaking, per hour? If we were to estimate that they worked around 20 hours per week, this equals 1,040 hours per year. Now, divide $76,000 by 1,040 and you get a staggering figure of $73 per hour. This is how much money an average Egyptian was able to make from the time he started working. No college degrees, 10 years experience, bullshit unpaid internships, or stupid job interviews required. And here you are, being told by delusional boomers and corporate shills that a $15 per hour minimum wage is unrealistic and entitled and would crash the economy. Hey guys, you may have noticed we're extremely close to 10,000 subscribers now. So if you're new here and enjoying this content, definitely consider subscribing and helping us get closer to this magic number. Would really mean a lot. Thanks a bunch. You guys are awesome. Part 2, Ancient Rome. Our next stop in our journey through time lands us in the ancient Roman Empire, some 2,000 years ago. This is a society that was incredibly advanced for its time, boasting all kinds of technologies from aqueducts to concrete to even hot tubs and jacuzzis. Whenever I make these types of videos, I always get some corporate chill in the comments going, but we have better technology today. We have toilets and electricity and computers. I'm going to quickly address this now before I see a million more of these in the comments. We are talking strictly about working conditions and wages here. We're not talking about technology. That is a whole separate issue. Of course, our technology is better. We're literally living 2,000 years later. I'm sure people in the year 4000 will have better technology than us too, no matter what economic system they have. Let's take a look at the life and work cycle of an urban Roman slave. We're not even talking about an average Roman citizen here. An urban Roman slave had better effective wages and working conditions than Gen Z has today. The average Roman slave worked no more than 6, at most 7 hours per day. Based on Seneca's letters and archaeological records, a typical workday for a Roman slave consisted of around 3 hours of housework in the morning. This included tasks such as fetching water, cleaning the house, and preparing breakfast for the master. At around noon, they would take a 3-hour siesta break to escape the midday heat, and they would use this time to eat, nap, or play games. This is a common practice that you still see in Italy today. Then, from around 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., slaves attended to minor tasks such as gardening, household repairs, or childcare. And finally, to end the day, they would set up dinner for their masters, and after 6 p.m., the lack of artificial lighting back then meant that once it got dark, the work was over. No emails to check, no being harassed by your boss with text messages about the next deadline, quarterly earnings report, or performance review. Beyond the fewer hours and more extensive breaks Roman slaves enjoyed throughout the day, they also enjoyed anywhere between 100 to 130 days of holiday per year. This was the norm for all Roman slaves and citizens. There was a festival in December known as Saturnalia, where slaves got 5+ days off and actually feasted with their masters, something your jackass boomer boss would never do for you. Now, you may be noticing a pattern here. Remember in our ancient Egypt example, how people essentially took 3 months off during the Nile flooding season. And as we covered in another video, medieval peasants also had between 100 to 150 days of holiday per year. It seems that taking long, extended breaks was actually the norm for the overwhelming majority of human history. People just seem to like this biological rhythm of work across many different time periods and cultures. It's just funny because Gen Z and millennials get relentlessly criticized as being lazy for wanting better wages and more time off. But if you were to resurrect most people in human history from ancient Rome to the Middle Ages, they would probably tell you that working 40 hours a week with only 2 weeks vacation and still not making enough to pay for basic food and shelter is straight up insane. They would likely tell you that it's employers who are the lazy and entitled snowflakes for thinking they're entitled to that much labor while paying such low dogshit wages. Now, beyond the 6-hour workdays and the insane 100 holidays per year that Roman slaves enjoyed, there is another and perhaps even bigger privilege they enjoyed over modern day Gen Z workers, and that is the issue of job security. Believe it or not, the average Roman slave had significantly better job security than a Gen Z gig worker today, being bounced around from one job to the next. Now, this sounds counterintuitive at first. Why wouldn't Roman masters just discard slaves like modern gig workers? The answer reveals a brutal but fascinating economic system that accidentally gave slaves more job stability than Gen Z gets today. You see, slaves were quite expensive. A healthy adult male slave would typically cost around 2,000 sesterces, about $20,000 in today's money. A typical Roman laborer would have to save up around 5 years' worth of wages to afford one. Slaves were a huge financial investment, and finding a new one would take months. Now, compare this to today's horrible job market, where jobs are scarce and workers have absolutely no leverage. The hefty financial investment required for a Roman slave meant that, unlike modern employers today, Roman slave owners actually had incentive to ensure your long-term well-being. And to top it all off, Roman slaves had a surprising amount of upward mobility, arguably more than Gen Z has today. There was a process known as manumission, where a slave could be legally and formally freed. The Emperor Pertinax was actually the son of a freed slave. And a lot of free slaves actually went on to be wealthy and influential. Not the majority by any means, but it was at least possible, unlike today. Perhaps the most jarring difference, however, is that the ancient Romans actually had a respectful, humanizing mentality towards their slaves. This excerpt from Seneca's book Letters from a Stoic sums it up quite perfectly. I'm glad to hear from these people who've been visiting you that you live on friendly terms with your slaves. It is just what one expects of an enlightened, cultivated person like yourself. They're slaves, people say. No, they're human beings. They're slaves, but they share the same roof as ourselves. They're slaves. No, they're friends. Humble friends. They're slaves. Strictly speaking, they're our fellow slaves. And if you once reflect that fortune has as much power over us as over them, this is why I laugh at those people who think it's degrading for a man to eat with his slave. Why do they think it's degrading? Now, compare this to your modern-day boss/manager who constantly walks around with his nose up, looking down on everyone else, never even taking the time to acknowledge your efforts, let alone invite you over for dinner. And now you see the point I made in the very beginning. Comparing modern-day working conditions Gen Z faces to slavery is indeed insensitive, just not towards who you thought. It's actually insensitive to Gen Z, not to ancient Roman slaves. So, if you enjoyed this type of historical comparison video, you'll definitely like this similar one where we compare modern Gen Z working conditions to medieval peasants, cavemen, and post-Civil War sharecroppers. Check it out. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.